Hey everyone, welcome to lecture 14. In this lecture, we will be continuing our discussion on JavaScript, and we will be discussing about array, object methods, and loops in JavaScript. So let's get right to it. Arrays in JavaScript work a little bit differently than what we have seen in C++ or Java. We already know that if we want to create a variable in JavaScript, we either use the let keyword or the const keyword, right? So you will have to use the same keywords for creating arrays as well. So for example, I will be creating a constant array. That is, I don't plan on changing the values inside this array in the future. So I'll be using the const keyword. And suppose I am creating an array called boys that will store values like this. It will store the values of some users like John, then suppose Alex and Adrian. So Alex, Adrian. Now see the syntax, or take a look at the syntax that I have used to create the array here. I have essentially used third bracket to essentially define that I am creating an array, and I have initialized this array with this three values. Okay, so three string values. Now there is another way we can create arrays in JavaScript. That is another syntax, which is also very simple. So suppose I am creating a girls array, and in this case I will be using the syntax as follows: new array. So essentially we will be using the function called array, and we will be creating an array by using this function. So suppose I am inserting these items here: Cassandra, Laura, and Yuna. So basically I have created two arrays with two syntaxes here. Now, if you want to access any of the elements inside these two arrays, the process is as simple as you have seen in C++ or in Java. So suppose I want to store the value of the first boy inside of the boys array, inside this person1 variable. And for that, all I have to do is like this, do something like this. So essentially I just have to indicate the index of the boy that I am indicating or referencing. Similarly, I can access any variable like this, or any index like this. So girls 2. So this variable is storing John, and this variable is storing Yuna. Okay, so now if I want to print these values inside my console, so I can do that as well. Console.log, and I will be using template literal to create a string here. So I can write something like this: person1 likes person2. Okay, now there is a very useful function in the array that we can use in JavaScript, which is called length, and this length function will give us essentially the length of the array. So I can say that the number of boys here is, and then again we will be using our template literal to print down the length of the boys array, and there. So if we print, or if we run this code now, let's see what we get. John likes Yuna. The number of boys here is 3. So essentially we have already said that person1 is storing John and person2 is storing Yuna, and the console is just printing that information, and at the same time, by using the boys.length function that we used here, we are printing down the number of elements inside the boys array. All right, now there are some useful functions, or before we actually move on to arrays, there is another thing I want to talk about. That is, before we move on to functions inside arrays, I want to talk about something else, which is the fact that in case of JavaScript arrays, there is no hard and fast rule that you have to have only one kind of one type of data inside your array. So what I mean by that is, it is entirely possible for a JavaScript array to have both number type data and string type data, or any other kind of data at the same time. So for example, I can create an array like this. Suppose let's create another array. That is, let's create another constant array, and let's create boy and girl age. Let's name an array like this and create an array with values as follows: John, 25, Yuna, 24. Oops, sorry. Yuna, 24. And if I directly want to print the content of this array in my console, then I can do something like this. And when I hit refresh, you can see that indeed I have obtained an array, and this array has two kinds of values, like, right? So it has a string value, and at the same time, it also has number value, right? So another thing we can do in arrays is that we can also insert a completely different array inside our original array. So suppose I want to store the boys array inside this boy and girl age array. Okay, so if I want, I can do that as well. Now if I refresh this, you can see that I have another array object here, and when I expand this, you can see that this array object contains the three boys that I have inserted inside the boys array. All right, so yeah, essentially there is a lot of flexibility when it comes to arrays in JavaScript. You can basically do whatever you want with arrays. Now let's take a look at some of the important functions that we can use whenever we work with arrays in JavaScript. Now, what you need to remember is there are countless functions that you can use with arrays in JavaScript, but I will only be showing you some of the most commonly used ones. So one of the most commonly used functions in JavaScript arrays is the push function, and this push function can be used to basically add elements to your array. That is, add elements at the end of your array. So I can do something like this: boys.push, and suppose I want to add another boy called Alan in my boys array. Okay, so what this will do is this will add an element called Alan inside my already existing boys array. So now if I want to, or if I print the value of the boys array again, you will see that I will have 4 elements instead of 3. So I have John, Alex, Adrian, and Alan. Okay, so let's comment this print statements here. Okay, also there is another function in boys array, and you might have guessed it already. It's called pop. So I can use the pop function to remove the last element inside my boys array, and here we don't have to pass anything, since it will simply be removing the last element from our boys array. Okay, and after doing this, if I print the boys array again, you will see that due to this line here, we have 4 elements, and for this line here, we have 3 elements. Okay, now something interesting to note when it comes to the push and pop function is that in case of the push function, this function also returns something, and it returns the length of the array. Okay, so I can do something like this: let length of array is equal to boys.push Alan, and this push function will essentially be returning the number of elements that are present inside the boys array after this element has been added. So if I print the length of the array here, I will get 4. Okay, and also in case of the pop function, it returns the element that has been removed. So suppose I can do something like this: let removed element is equal to boys.pop, and if I print the removed element here, then I should get Alan, because Alan was the last element inside our boys array. All right, so some other functions are, let's see, which function can we talk about? Okay, so there's a function called unshift, which adds an element at the first index of your array. So boys.unshift will be adding an element at the beginning of your array. So here, let's add Jonathan. Okay, and if I print the array here again, you will see that Jonathan has been added at the beginning of the array. And if you want to remove the first element from your array, we have another function for that, which is called which is called shift. So the shift function will be essentially deleting or popping the first element inside your array. Okay. Some other functions that we can talk about when it comes to arrays in JavaScript is the includes function and the index of function. So suppose I will be using the console.log to showcase this. So suppose I want to know the index of Jonathan inside this array. So for that, I can use index of, or sorry, boys dot index of, and here I can type Jonathan, and it will give us the index of the element that we're looking for. Now, in this case, you can see that we're getting -1. The reason we're getting -1 is because our index of function cannot find any element called Jonathan inside our array. So basically, from this, we understand that if we are trying to look for an element by using index of, it will be returning -1 in case that element does not exist. Now, why exactly we are getting -1 here? Well, the reason is we have added Jonathan using this line here, boys.unshift, but again, we have removed that element here, right? So boys.shift has removed the Jonathan element, and so we cannot find the index of that element. So instead, let's write Alex here. Let's refresh this page, and you can see we get 1. So just to remove some confusion, let's type in the current array at first. That is, let's try to find out the elements that are present inside this array at first. Hit refresh. So yeah, currently we have these 3 elements here, John, Alex, and Adrian. And since the position of Alex is 1 in this array, that is 0, 1, 2, this is 1, we are getting the value 1. All right. Now there is another element or another function inside array, or sorry, let me rephrase that. There is another function that we can use in case of JavaScript arrays, which is called includes. Okay. So this includes function, as you might have guessed, essentially just gives us a Boolean value that is either true or false and states whether or not we have a value inside an array or not. So if I type includes Alex, and if I run this, I'm getting true because Alex is an element that is present inside the boys array. Now, if I type something completely different, for example, if I type Jonathan, we know that Jonathan does not exist in the array right now, right? So if we run this now, we should get false. And indeed, as you can see, we are getting false. Okay. So these are some of the most commonly used functions that are used alongside arrays in JavaScript. There are obviously some other functions as well, but if you want, you can take a look at them by yourselves. Now, another important thing that I want to showcase when it comes to arrays is, let's take the boys array, or again, let's take the girls array for now, for our example. Okay. Now, you see that we have used the const keyword for the girls array, right? So that means that we have defined this array as a constant, and we cannot change it. So what do you think will happen if I write something like this? Girls 2 is equal to, suppose, Amina. All right, so what do you think will happen if I write something like this? Do you think the element will change? Well, let's find out. Let's print the girls array after we have done this. Oops, sorry. Yeah, let's type this now. So you can see that our third element, that is, which was initially, I think, Yuna, right? So it was initially Yuna, but now it has converted to Amina. So this is a bit of a contradiction, right? So even though we have declared the girls array as a constant, we are somehow still able to change an element inside the girls array. Well, the reason for this is the way JavaScript stores things in memory. Okay, so this is how JavaScript works in the backend. That is a discussion that we will not be having because it is outside the scope of our lecture. But for now, just understand that this happens because of the way JavaScript stores things in memory. All right. So even though we can change single elements like this whenever we write something like this, it is not possible to change the entire array itself. So for example, I cannot do something like this. Girls is equal to suppose 1, 2, 3. We cannot do this because we will get an error that says we are trying to assign a value to a constant variable or a constant array. Okay, so yeah, that is all the things that I want to discuss about arrays. Now let's move on to objects. Okay, so we will be using our existing knowledge on arrays to understand how objects work in JavaScript. Okay, so we already know that in case of arrays, it is possible to store different types of values inside our arrays, right? So we can store strings, we can store numbers, we can even store an entire array itself inside an array. Okay, so for our example here, let's create an array called employee. Oops, yeah. Let's create an array called employee details, and let's initialize it as follows. So we'll be using a new line here just for understanding purposes. Just remember that when it comes to arrays, if you have multiple elements, you have to separate those elements with a comma. So as long as you separate your elements with a comma, it doesn't really matter whether you are inserting them in different lines or not. Okay, so anyway, let's say that the name of our employee is John. Let's say that his position is engineer. His age, suppose, is 25. His current salary is, suppose, $1,200. And his list of most used gadgets is another array. So we can say something like a smartphone. We can say iPad. And suppose smart watch. Okay, so essentially we have 5 elements inside this array. 2 of these elements are string, 2 of these elements are number, and the 5th element is an array itself. So this is how arrays work in JavaScript, right? Now the problem with this is that there is exactly no way we can understand what each of this value is implying, right? So when defining this array, or when defining this array, I said that John is the name of the employee that I am talking about, right? But there is no way for the computer to actually understand that John is actually the name, right? So essentially, this creates some kind of problems. Well, the solution to these problems, or the solution to this specific problem, can be found by using objects. So an object in JavaScript allows us to create key value pairs instead of simply values like this. Okay, so if we want to create an object inside JavaScript, we can use the same syntax, or kind of the same syntax. So let's comment this out for now. And let's create an object called employee details. And for creating an object, instead of using a third bracket like this when we create any arrays, we will be using curly braces. Okay, so now we will be writing down the details of our employee in key and value pairs. So we know that, or we don't know anything. We are essentially just defining this according to our will. So let's say name is the key, and the value of this key is John. Okay, so we have created our first element, that is our first key and value pair inside our object. Similarly, let's add all the other elements as well. So position, engineer, age 25, salary 1200, and finally we have another array, and let's name this array as most used gadgets. So I'm getting the autocomplete here because I have written this example down in another file, so it's just referencing that file for this autocomplete. So anyway, this most used gadgets is another element, that is another array. So smartphone, iPad, and smartwatch. Okay, so we have created our object like this, and Now you might be wondering, other than the key and value pair that we are seeing inside the object, what other differences exist between arrays and objects when it comes to JavaScript? Well, the most obvious difference between these two is the fact that we have an index when it comes to array, but when it comes to objects, we do not really have any index. So index is important in arrays because the only way we can actually access any of those elements inside our array is by using that index, right? However, in case of objects, we do not really need that index. We can simply reference the key and we can then get the value for that key. All right, so for example, when we want to access any value inside our object, we can either use the dot notation or the third bracket notation. So let me write this, dot or bracket. Okay, so suppose I want to access the name of our employee. So for that, all we have to do is console.log employee details dot name. So this is the dot notation, and the dot notation will give us the name of our employee. Now in this case, we are getting an array. Okay, so the exception is, or the error is, assignment to constant variable in line 337. Okay, so I forgot to comment this thing, so let me just comment this things here. Okay, so now if we run this, you can see that we are getting the name of the employee as John because we have used the dot notation here to access the name essentially. Now if we want to use the bracket notation, it's pretty simple as well. So console.log, and here we will write employee details. And now to use the bracket, we simply have to do something like this. Now we have five key value pairs here, right? So suppose I want to say the salary. So here all I have to do is write down salary inside this quotation, and when I run this, you see that I'm getting 1200. So these are the two notations that I can use to access any of the values inside my object. Now you might be wondering which notation you should be using. Well, the answer to that is it really depends on your scenario. So whenever you are using the dot notation, remember that you have to use the name of the key exactly as it has been stated inside your object. All right. However, in case of bracket notation, if you want, you can actually at first evaluate which key that the user is trying to access, and then write down that key inside of the bracket. So what I mean by that is, suppose you do not know which property or which key value pair the user is trying to access. Okay, so suppose I can create a prompt here that asks the user, which property would you like to see? And suppose the user will write something like position or salary or most used gadgets, etc. So we will store that value somewhere. Okay, so let's say we are storing that value in X. And now if I want to show the user that specific property, all I have to do is this. I have the value of X as the exact property that the user is trying to see, and by using that value inside our bracket here, we can essentially access that value. Now you can already understand that this would not work if we had used the dot notation, right? So if we want to at first evaluate what exactly or which exact property we want to see, and then we want to insert that property inside our, or we want to access that property, then we have to use the third brackets or the bracket notation like this. So let's see what happens. So as you can see, which property would you like to see is we are getting the prompt, we're getting a message in this prompt. So let's type H. If we hit OK, we are getting 25. And again, if we refresh and we type something like salary, we're getting 1200. So as you understand from this, it really depends on your scenario, whether you have to use the dot notation or you want to use the bracket notation. Okay, now using this dot and bracket notation, we can also add more properties to our object. Now, You will hear me use the term property a lot of times when we'll be accessing these elements. So for example, since we have 5 key value pairs here, we can say that this object has 5 properties. Okay, so anyway, let's try and add some properties, or add some more properties to this object. So employee details. Now suppose I want to add another property inside this employee details called a last name. Okay, so to add a last name, we can do something like this: Jonathan Kyleberg, or Jonathan and Adrian. Suppose we are assuming that the last name of this guy is Adrian. Okay, so simply by doing this, we have essentially added another property to our employee details object. So if I want, so to show you that we have indeed added another property to this object, we can log this in our console, employee details, and we hit refresh, that prompt again. And if we hit refresh, you can see that our object has 6 properties now instead of 5 properties. So age, name, position, salary, and last name. Okay, so this is how we can use the dot notation to create a new property inside our object. We can also use the bracket notation to add a property as well, and that is very simple as well. So employee details, and now we will be creating another bracket like this. And suppose I want to name that property as favorite anime. Okay, and I want to give the value of this favorite anime as Dragon Ball Z. Now if I refresh this, or before refreshing this, let's try and print this again here. Also, let's comment out that prompt. Okay, and if we refresh this now, and if we see here, here we have added only one element called, or one property called last name by using the dot notation. So it's not showing the, or is it showing? Oh, it is showing the favorite anime. Okay, so this is yeah, so this is essentially showing that we have added 2 properties, favorite anime as well as last name. Okay, yeah, so as you can already understand, by following this dot notation, or by following this bracket notation, we can add more properties to our object like this. Okay, now there are some more topics that we need to cover when it comes to object, and that is called object methods. So let's see, this was number 14. Our next topic is going to be object methods. So there are a lot of things that we can do when it comes to object methods, so let's get right to it. All right, so when it comes to object methods in JavaScript, these object methods are regarded as properties of the object itself. So to understand what we mean, let's use the same object that we have created here, and let's make some changes. So instead of having the age here directly, let's term this property as birth year, and let's give here the value as 2000. Okay, now if you remember, when it comes to functions or methods, there are 3 ways or 3 syntaxes that you can follow to create functions, right? So we can either use function declaration, or we can use function expression, or we can use arrow function, which is basically just another form of function expressions, right? So when you will be creating object methods, that is functions related to an object, you will have to follow the function expression syntax. That is, you will have to create function expressions and not function declarations. So if you don't remember, function expressions can be created like this. So suppose I want to create a function expression called calc age, that is calculate age. So the way I can do that is like this, right? So I have the function keyword followed by the parenthesis, inside which, if we want, we can pass in a parameter, and then we have the function body. Now remember, as I said earlier, in case of objects, functions or object methods are regarded as property itself, as properties themselves. Okay, so since we want to create a property called calcAge inside the employee details object, we will do something like this: calcAge, then we have our colon followed by function, then we have our parenthesis followed by our function body. So yeah, that's it. That is how we can create object methods. Okay, now you remember that function expressions can also be written in the form of array functions, right? So if we wanted, we could have replaced the syntax with something like this, right? So we are essentially using the arrow function syntax here. So just to keep things simple, we will be using the expression or the function expression that we know of. And here, to calculate the age, let's do something like this. So this function will take birth year as input, and it will return the current age of the employee like this: 2020 minus birth year. Okay, so the way we can call this function is also pretty simple. We simply have to use the dot notation or the bracket notation. So if I want to use the dot notation, I will do something like this: employee details dot calcAge, and inside I can pass the value of the birth year of the employee, right? And if I want to use the bracket notation, that is, if I want to use third brackets, I can do it as well. So calcAge, and then here I can do I can do something like this: 2000, right? Now let's log this in the console. Let's see what we get. We have received an error, right? Okay, so here there has to be a comma anyway. So okay, now if we refresh this, we can see that we are indeed getting the current age of the employee. All right, now one thing you can notice here, or you should have noticed here, is that we are passing the birth year of the employee inside this function, but it's kind of redundant because we already have the birth year of the employee as a value inside, or as a property inside this object, right? So we don't really need to pass in a parameter here. We can simply use the birth year that is already present inside this object, right? And for that, what we can do is, instead of passing the birth year like this, we can simply write 2020 minus this dot birth year. Okay, so when we use the this keyword inside an object, we are implying that or this keyword is implying that we want to use the object itself. So this dot birth year essentially means we want to access the birth year that is already present inside this object. Okay, so that's what this keyword means. So we don't really have to pass any parameter here anymore. And if we run this function again, as you can see, we get the value 20. Now suppose this is a very simple function. Suppose I have a very complicated function inside my object, which is very resource intensive. That is, it hogs a lot of resources whenever it is executed. So ideally, what I would want to do is, whenever that function is executed the first time, I would want to store that value somewhere, and any time or any number of times that that function is called in the future, I simply want to return the value that has been stored inside that property, okay, or inside that variable. So what I am trying to say is, suppose this function is being called a couple of times. So for example, in this case, it is getting called 3 times, right? Now, evaluating this function each of these times is kind of unnecessary because we are essentially returning the same value. So what I want to do is, I want to store this value somewhere, and then after the first time, any other time that function is called, I simply want to return that value. So the way we can do this is also very simple. We can use the this keyword again. Suppose I will be storing the value inside a property called age, and I can write something like this: this dot age is equal to 2020 minus this dot birth year. And I can simply return this dot age, right? So when we write something like this, what is happening is, this function, whenever it will be executed the first time, it will create a property called age, and it will store the value of 2020 minus this dot birth year inside that property. Okay, so instead of having to call this function so many times like this, let's simplify this a bit. Let's just write calc age here. Okay, so dot notation is useful whenever we want to simplify things. Okay, so we will be using the dot notation here. So anyway, we have used, or we have called the function once here, right? So after this line has been rendered, or after this line has been compiled, this function will be called, and the age property will be created inside the employee details object. Okay, so each time we want to access that property, we simply have to write employee details dot age, and the same thing can be copied here as well. And now we should get the line 20 printed 3 times. So yeah, as you can see, we have received 20 3 times. So that's how objects work in, or object methods work in JavaScript. Okay. All right, so one last topic before we end our discussion today is loops in JavaScript. Okay, so loops are very simple in JavaScript because they follow the same syntax that we are familiar with in Java and C++. So suppose you want to run a for loop. For that, what all you have to do is something like this. For then we have to create a variable. Suppose I equals to 0. I want to run this loop for 10 times. So let's do this. And here, all I want to do is I want to print the value of I. Okay, so let's write this is the, or let's write something like number of loop iteration is equal to, then since we are using template literal, we can do something like this. And there we go. So if we run this loop, we should get the numbers 0 to 9. Okay, so yeah, 0 to 9. So as you can already understand, the syntax for creating loops in JavaScript is essentially the same as in your languages like C++ or Java. So you can follow the while syntax as well, and it will give you the same results. Another thing, the break and continue keywords also works the same way as in Java or C++. So I'm just not going to go too in depth with those details because you guys can already figure those out on your own. Okay. So that's it for today's lecture. We covered some very short topics today, but hopefully you were able to understand each of them. And as always, if you have any question, then you can let me know in our live class tomorrow, and I will try to answer them to the best of my abilities. So I'll see you then. Take care and stay safe.